o'clock news from the BBC with Peter Sissons and Moira Stewart.
Good evening. The headlines at 6 o'clock. Britain prepares to send a force of tanks to the Gulf as a further contribution to the multinational force. The tanks will be sent from the British Army of the Rhine. Ministers will decide the final shape and size of the force later this week. The Archbishop of Canterbury welcomes European moves to free the hostages in the Lebanon. He says there are real signs of progress. Lockerbie air crash investigators say aircraft should be strengthened to help them withstand terrorist bomb attacks. The Soviet Prime Minister threatens to resign as President Gorbachev rejects his plans for reform. And haemophiliacs who contracted the AIDS virus from infected blood products go to court for compensation. Britain is preparing to send tanks to the Gulf. The only uncertainty is how many. Mrs. Thatcher and a group of senior ministers took the decision in principle today. Full details are expected at the end of the week. It's understood from defence sources in Whitehall that there's some disagreement over whether to send a full armoured brigade, that's 100 tanks and 4,000 men, or whether to send a smaller force of perhaps 60 tanks, which would be cheaper and easier to move. Our defence correspondent David Shookman reports.
Just at the moment when the ending of the Cold War was to force the return of British tanks back home from Germany, between 60 and 100 now seem likely to be diverted to Saudi Arabia instead. It's a deployment that would complete Britain's presence on the front line with Iraq, already in the air and at sea, now on the ground as well. It won't be an easy move, whatever the size of tank force ministers decide on. Transporting them could take a month, and they'll require huge supplies.
It will be a complicated operation, because not only will the troops and their equipment have to go, but all their logistic support, all their ammunition, and who knows for how many days they will need it, and also all the spare parts and the mechanics to keep these vehicles going. The thing is, they'll all be different from the equipment already in use by the Arab forces and particularly by the American forces.
But the American Secretary of State, James Baker, today in Moscow will no doubt be pleased. When the final decision is taken, probably on Friday, it looks as though it'll meet his request for European troops to join the American ones in the Gulf already. Moving in beside the American force with heavy British armour would be a signal of diplomatic intent both to Washington and to Saddam Hussein. This comes as the Pentagon itself is publicising its enforcement of the blockade of Iraq. It released this footage of the USS Goldsborough intercepting the Iraqi freighter the Zenubia, laden with tea, in the Gulf of Oman last week.
The United States intends no harm to your vessel.
It's the clearest example so far of Iraqi attempts to bust sanctions and of the attempts by the UN to enforce them, a policy involving a military commitment in the Gulf region in which Britain's role can only grow.
Iraq is allowing a British diplomat from Baghdad to go to occupied Kuwait to help the latest group of British women and children who want to leave. The Foreign Office said it was expecting about 100 of them to leave Kuwait on a chartered Iraqi plane tomorrow. Conditions for the remaining diplomats there are deteriorating, and there are reports of food riots in Kuwait City. This report from Brian Barron in Baghdad was censored by the Iraqi authorities.
Are they flinty patriots showing blind loyalty to Iraq's strongman, or are they dancing against the West on government orders? The answer perhaps is elements of both. This is a crisis in which truth has been an early casualty, especially for a secretive society which finds itself alienated from the world for swallowing Kuwait.
We are fighting for the truth. If the USA government know the truth, I'm sure they will never ask for war.
But the damaging truth about scores of thousands of fleeing migrant workers discussed tonight at this emergency meeting of Third World ambassadors is something withheld locally.
I pray morning and evening that whenever I can, that there's no outbreak of cholera or anything like that.
And what about the truth about hostages? Even the UN at this meeting can't help. This is a man in a gilded cage. Andrew Peake was unlucky to be on the BA flight that landed in Kuwait just before Iraq's invasion. Now he's detained in a Baghdad luxury hotel. He calls himself a guestage, a cross between a guest who can't leave and a hostage. He's Australian and is therefore less vulnerable than British friends.
I was sitting in his room having a beer one day, and he got a knock on his door and was asked to pack his bags and come down to the lobby, and that he was going with 2 other Brits to some facility.
In pursuit of truth about UK citizens in Kuwait, British diplomat James Tansley went there tonight to fix an evacuation flight. 100 British dependents will leave Kuwait tomorrow. Mr. Tansley is the first British diplomat allowed to visit Kuwait since the invasion. Why can't our own diplomats who are still hanging on in Kuwait do this job?
They have, although in theory they have diplomatic immunity, they are not accredited to the embassy in Baghdad. The Iraqis have made it quite clear that diplomats from the embassies in Kuwait who remain in Kuwait are to be treated as ordinary citizens, i.e. they go against the terms of the Vienna Convention in terms of diplomatic immunity. We do not want to take the risk with our diplomats from Kuwait.
There are hundreds of Westerners, Britons among them, still in hiding in Kuwait. Are you going to try and persuade them to give themselves up?
I've got no more to say. Thanks very much.
In this nation, which sees itself threatened on all sides, precautions against dangerous truths are inevitable.
Our apologies for the quality of the sound on that report. The Minister for Overseas Development, Linda Chalker, is flying to Jordan for talks on helping the refugees in the camps near the Iraqi border. She's travelling on a plane which is taking supplies for the camps. An appeal aimed at raising money to help Jordan deal with the influx of refugees will be launched on television later this evening. It's supported by 5 major charities. Kate Adey, the BBC's chief news correspondent, visited one of the camps.
A modern exodus leaves a trail of plastic water bottles and tests the will to survive. 6 weeks ago, these Bangladeshis had office jobs in Kuwait, supported families back home and added slowly to their little nest eggs in Kuwaiti banks. 3 weeks ago, they left, jobs and savings having evaporated. First, they trekked through Iraq to the Iranian border and were stopped. Then they went and camped on the border with Turkey.
Then we lived there 4 days. There's many people in Bangladeshi, Indian and Pakistani. Then there is no exit going set in Turkey. Then we come again in Baghdad, then we try to come again here. Then we live here more than 6 days.
Like most of the 70-odd thousand Asians in Jordanian camps, Mohammed Sur, whose sister lives in London, has lost everything. He's grateful for help, but has observed shortcomings.
I have seen in the market, they have a meat bottle, which is written from the European Economic Authority, a gift from the European Economic Authority. But they are selling. I think that is for us, but we have to buy from them.
Exploitation and exhaustion, thousands in a muddle of sand and dust. The dust devils wreck the game attempts at domestic order, which are impressive in this wilderness. With the best will in the world, it's almost impossible to make life in a desert like this tolerable, especially for people who've been on the move, some of them for weeks. In many ways, it's remarkable that they put up with so much and that they complain so little. And a combination of aid, expert help and sheer determination to survive with dignity is sustaining this migration. Kate Adey, BBC News, on the Jordanian border.